Hello students, my name is Manasseh Begay and I just wanted to introduce myself. I waited to do that for this chapter for a reason. Um, my name is Manasseh Begay. I am faculty here with Dene College in the social work program. I am a licensed clinical social worker as well as a licensed alcohol and drug abuse counselor here in the state of New Mexico. That's where I live. I've been here with Dene College for about going on 2 years now. Prior to this, I was involved in clinical counseling. I still am involved in counseling. I have several private clients which I see for either substance abuse or mental health reasons. Before moving into this field, I was in law enforcement. I was a cop for 5 years. And prior to that, I was a firefighter, and I did that for a number of years before that as well. I'm married. I have 2 kids. They are getting bigger and getting older, of course. And originally, from my mom's side, I am White Mountain Apache. My clan from my mother is Dischidan, which means that I'm the Bear Clan, but more specifically, my lineage from the Bear Clan comes from the town of Sibique, Arizona. My Navajo side is Ma'idishkijni. And if you look back to that origins, Ma'idishkijni, the people have come from Jemez and were adopted into the Navajo tribe. And those are my backgrounds from both of my parents. And that's an aspect of who I am culturally. As you guys know, as you may know, we try to introduce ourselves and not just who I am as a person, but where I come from. And that's a big aspect of Navajo culture and Native culture, I would say, as more of a whole. And kind of as we look at this chapter and some of these books and some of the discussions we may or may not have, we're going to generalize things. And I know that's not necessarily a good thing, as we are all a different person, but there are some overarching beliefs that the majority of, say, Native people will have, or the majority of Anglo people. And so in general is going to be kind of the way we see a lot of this stuff. And as we look kind of at race and culture, those are 2 different things, and sometimes we have trouble differentiating the 2 differences between race and culture. Race, if you look at that by itself, is going to be this biological aspect of who you are as a person. I myself am Native American. My family has been Native American, so we've been that for many years. But if you kind of look at, I would say, again, in general, as a whole, race, many tribes, many people, I'm half Navajo, half Apache. So am I full Navajo? No, I'm not. Am I full Apache? No, I'm not. So there's a little bit of a blend there in who I am as a person. And there has been a lot of that in this country as a whole, in the world as a whole, where there's been this integration of different races into who you are. And as culturally goes, that's going to be, again, seen a little bit differently. And when we start looking at things from a race perspective, we usually tend to segregate, not necessarily just myself from another group, but from one group to a different group. And that's never usually a good thing, because we do this comparison process, us versus them, me versus you. And when I meet with clients, I try to tell them all the time, when we start comparing, it usually comes down to either I'm better than you or you're better than me. And neither of those comparisons are ever good. So let's try not to look at things from a race perspective, but let's look towards a culture. And this gives us a greater idea of how to generalize things. culturally, who am I? Culturally, where am I from? And this kind of goes back to, what do I believe in? What do my family believe in? And what type of uh, mindset do I come from? What are some of the morals that are taught from my culture? What are some of the belief systems that are taught from my culture? And you can see this very regularly if you look at it. A lot of times we don't really look and say, okay, that's actually an aspect of my culture and who I am. It typically comes preconsciously. I don't have to think about my culture. It just is there. So if you think about, we'll just say Native Americans and some of our cultural beliefs that, again, in general, that we may have is maybe we have a greater respect for the earth as a whole. We have hopefully a greater respect for our elders because they have a greater sense of value than, say, another culture might not have that same view of their elders. But in this culture, we have that viewpoint. One story that I think about from my grandma is when my aunt was first married to her husband. And culturally, my grandma and my aunt's husband are not allowed to be in the same room together. So, and this was quite many years ago. And so every time my aunt's husband, my uncle, came into the room, my grandma would tend to leave and go out a different door and not be in that same presence. And that's a cultural thing that's very specific. Towards the end, they didn't really practice that anymore. My grandma and my uncle were in the same room very regularly, and that cultural aspect kind of shifted over time. And our cultures do shift over time. If we look at Native culture, and it has changed as the years go by, but change is a part of our culture as a whole too. So, and it's not that we're moving away from who we are, it's that our culture identity shifts in a way. And so we have to think about some of those shifts that do occur in our lives. And when we think about that, and we look at other cultures out there, they shift as well. I'm sure many of you have heard the term like melting pot. The United States is a melting pot. And that's true to a point, though. The melting pot was typically going to be your Caucasian, your white cultures melting together. That didn't necessarily equate to Native Americans joining that, or African Americans joining that, or Asian Americans joining. It was more that white Caucasian culture joined during that period, and that was what melted. And then it became, I am white, and that was easier for somebody to say because it was more of an moving away from my past and who I was, because several white cultures were not seen as a positive thing back then, and so they became white versus people of color. And so the melting pot was not for us as Native people or us as people of color. It was for that white culture that became what melted. And as we look now at Natives as a whole, there are 512 as of who knows when exactly, 512 federally recognized tribes. That means they are tribes that the government says that, yes, you are a Native American tribe. And again, the federal government doesn't use the term Native American. That's a term that I choose to use. The federal government uses the term American Indian, Alaskan Native. And that is the federally recognized verbiage, but I choose to use the term Native American. I feel that it's more respectful to our people as a whole. But there are those 512 federally recognized tribes. On top of that, there are 365 state recognized tribes across the country. So each of our cultures, it would be very difficult for me to try to speak for a different tribe or a different person, or even my tribe as a whole, because again, we would overgeneralize things. In general, this is the way it is. And it's very difficult to do that. But you can see some of these differences when it comes to how we act as people. Um, Native Americans, Asian Americans, Latin Americans, African Americans, we have a greater sense of community as a whole, um, or a greater sense of family. I was just talking to my daughter about how, she has a brother, a biological brother, but she also has all these other sisters and brothers out there who are not necessarily biologically from me or my wife. They are cousins, but in my culture, they're brothers and sisters to her, and that's the way it is seen, and that's what they are. Just like they are my children, they are my sons and daughters also at the same time. And that's that cultural difference that you may not get in a white culture, a Caucasian culture, or several other cultures out there. But in these cultures, that's that extended family. They are my family. They are who I would be there to protect and to care for, and they are of value to me in that way. And that's an important part of who they are. These cultures also kind of respond differently.